Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Am I on? All right. Okay. Yeah, I was waiting for the bell, and Jacob just informed me there is no bell. Since because we have moved our time to the alternative time instead of the scriptural time, we'll not have a bell tonight. So we'll just get started. We won't wait for the formalities of the bell. All right. So tonight, the main text is Acts chapter 21. And I do want to talk about one issue in Acts chapter 20 that we didn't address on Sunday. And of course, the context, we kind of jumped into the middle of the end of the story here after going through Galatians and Romans. Just because we're here, the thesis of the book of Romans, remember, is Romans chapter 1 and verses 16 and 17. And really, the book of Galatians, I think, is kind of a Reader's Digest. Romans, both are Paul's outlines of the gospel. Galatians deals almost exclusively with the idea that you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. And Romans expands on the truth of the gospel, and namely in verses 16 and 17, that it is the power of God for salvation, and that salvation is available to everyone, and that salvation is made available on the basis of belief. The Jews and the Greeks, having expressed belief, can be made righteous. The righteousness of Abraham was accredited to him before. Jacob was a big fat liar, apparently. The righteousness of Abraham was credited before the old law. Abraham was made righteous on the basis of his belief. And so Abraham is our father, a father of all faithful who expressed that belief in God, and that righteousness revealed from faith to faith. And again, we're having left Galatians and Romans, two letters that talk about those topics. Paul is now going to go back to Jerusalem, and this will be his last visit in Jerusalem. We'll see some of the different prophecies that people are making in Acts chapter 21, but essentially everyone knows that he is visiting, that they probably won't see him again. Now, they suspect that he's just going to be killed and martyred in Jerusalem, I think, but he is actually, of course, taken from Jerusalem to Rome to appeal to Caesar, and historically he's beheaded there at Rome by the Romans, but he's not killed by the Jews, as many people think he was going to be. So again, tonight we're going to be in Acts chapter 20, Acts chapter 21. I won't talk too much more about the uproar that's going to happen in Acts chapter 21, because I do want to talk about one topic we left unaddressed in Acts chapter 20, and that is the importance of the first day of the week. Paul, in Acts chapter 20 and verses 7 through 12, that the story there centers around the idea that Paul prioritized meeting with the brothers in Philippi on the first day of the week. He says, on the first day of the week, we were gathered together to break bread, and Paul began talking to them. So I want to talk about the importance of this concept, breaking bread, and specifically on the first day of the week. Before I get into the topic of the Lord's Supper and the frequency by which I think we're supposed to observe it, does anybody have any comments that they want to get out before I start talking? Okay, of course, there are different Christian groups who think differently about the Lord's Supper. My opinion is essentially the tradition that we were raised in. I think that's the correct way to do it, which is you meet on the first day of the week, and one of the things you do is you meet as a church on the first day of the week is the breaking of the bread, which is the observance of the Lord's Supper. I think that's the way to do it for several reasons, but that's not the only exclusive opinion among people who observe Christianity, call themselves Christians. So the reasons I think that the Lord's Supper is to be observed every first day of the week are essentially that this is what Paul was going to do in Philippi. He stayed there on the first day of the week for the purpose of the breaking of the bread. Another letter in which Paul talks about the breaking of bread, of course, what Glenn studied in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul criticizes the church at Corinth when they gather together to break bread. Paul says it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. And he says it's not to eat the Lord's Supper because they were doing it in such a divided way. So the idea, the reason I think that Paul addresses the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 11 in the way that he does is because it's widely accepted that the Lord's Supper is observed on every first day of the week when the church is gathered together. Just as it is here in Acts chapter 20, the church is gathered together in Philippi to observe the Lord's Supper. You also have a note from Luke in Acts chapter 2. At the end of Acts chapter 2, it says the church in verse 42 was continually devoting themselves, or itself, if you're talking about the church, to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of the bread, and to prayer. Just as a quick aside, I don't think that is a common meal, because a common meal is mentioned in Acts chapter 2 and verse 46, as they were sharing their meals together, breaking bread from house to house. And so these three passages in consideration, in the context of these three passages, I think the Bible example is our practice here, and that is taking the Lord's Supper when you gather together. God wants us to take it every first day of the week. Now, really quickly, there are different arguments against that. I don't think they're accurate, but there are certain arguments that say the frequency with which the early church observed the Lord's Supper is never addressed. There's no specific command where you have to meet together every first day of the week, and as part of that meeting on the first day of the week, you have to break bread. It's just not mentioned there. It doesn't say that you have to do that every first day of the week. That's one of the examples, or that's one of the arguments, rather, against that. There are other arguments against the necessity of observing the Lord's Supper. Some people say if we did it every week, it wouldn't be the same. It would be less special. It wouldn't be as special as Paul and Christ wanted it to be. And of course they say, the meal in which Christ exemplified the Lord's Supper was the Passover meal, which was observed once a year. And so for that purpose, we don't feel like we need to observe the Lord's Supper every week. Talked to a couple of different people, and there are some people that think when the church broke away from Catholicism, hundreds of years ago, some of the Catholic practices were to observe the Lord's Supper every day. The sacrament could be taken as often as you wanted to. And so as a response to that, the church kind of swung back and said, we don't have to do it every day. We don't have to do it every week. We'll just do it when we want to do it, when we decide we want to do it. So I think all those are kind of weak arguments. The idea that it becomes less special if you do it more frequently, then why would you do anything on any first day of the week? Why would you even assemble on the first day of the week if it's less special? So I don't think that argument is super strong. So those are my thoughts on the issue. I think, again, that the idea that it shouldn't be done on the first day of the week, on every first day of the week, I think is incorrect. I have a lot of problems with that. Just speaking with another friend of mine, he kind of said, that, and this is not scriptural or anything, but he said that the closer you get to patterning the gospel, the more importance you should have on that act of worship. Namely, the Lord's Supper and baptism are two critical things that pattern the gospel, and we shouldn't be so quick to neglect those things. And I agree with that. For that reason, and for the reasons I just mentioned, I think the Lord's Supper should be observed weekly on the basis of those teachings and the examples that we have there. So I know this is a pretty friendly audience to that position. Does anybody have any other comments about that? Jordan, do you have something? Yeah, I agree with what Jordan said. He mentions several different things. Um, yeah, I agree with what he said. It just to add to what he said, the renewal of the covenant meal is an important aspect of the Lord's Supper. The idea that Jesus is communing with us, and that each week we're communing with Jesus and He with us and with each other. I think that's a big part of it. I think Jordan referred to some of that. Also, I'll say, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:26, as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. We, for ourselves, say Jesus died. Here's why He died. Here's why He rose again. We're making that proclamation every time we do it. Now, if some say the argument that Paul said, or some say their argument is when Paul said, as often as you eat it, he's saying, as often as you want to. You can do it weekly, you can do it monthly, you can do it quarterly. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying whenever you do it on the first day of the week, you're doing this, remembering Jesus, as Jordan said. So, again, I know it's a friendly audience. We're not going to have a lot of debate on the other side, but I do think our tradition is the correct tradition. Go ahead, John. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, John said Jesus rose on the first day of the week. Yeah, the tradition of meeting on the first day of the week is widely accepted. Um, Even in the book of Acts here, Acts chapter 20, it was the first day of the week. The church was meeting. Here in Philippi, they met to break bread. Um, so that's what I think. You can. There are several different articles on the affirmative of that position, and several different things you can read at the opposite of that position. But again, I think our tradition is correct. I think it should be, and is good to do it on the first day of the week. I don't see a lot of arguments other than the convenience aspect of it that are very convincing, to be honest. But again, you can read and read that for yourself. But that's my position. I think that's what the Bible teaches. So, all right. Anything else on Acts chapter 20? Okay. So, Acts chapter 21, again, the context of this, Paul is ending his third missionary journey. He's leaving Asia, and I want to mention the leaving Ephesus in Asia because that is kind of a critical aspect of Acts chapter 21. Remember, when Paul was in Ephesus the last time, there was a big riot, and specifically there was a riot because the men of Ephesus were thinking that Paul was kind of after their goddess, Diana. And really, the crux of the issue is the same issue that Paul was dealing with in Galatians. And that issue was the Jewish Christians, the believers from the Pharisees and the believers with a heavy Jewish background didn't like the idea that a Gentile could just walk in and become part of the family. Remember, historically, Paul said the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. The Jews had a special place because, of course, Jesus came from a Jewish family. The Jewish tradition, all the prophecies and the law, all of that was rolled into Jesus. And so these Jews said, look, we don't want to give away our position. We don't mind that Gentiles are now brought into this olive tree, but we think they should observe our own traditions, namely in Galatians, circumcision. And so that's the crux of the issue. The Jews are upset over the fact that Paul is exclusively teaching to the Gentiles, and we'll see that play out here in Acts chapter 21. But Paul is on the way back to Jerusalem, and he's kind of saying his last goodbyes to the different people here in Acts chapter 20 and Acts chapter 21. So we'll see what happens here in Acts chapter 21. Yeah, Paul was... Yeah, certainly. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, right? And so it's interesting, God chose him to teach, to be a minister to the Gentiles, to teach where Jesus had never been taught. And that says a lot about the conflict God knew was going to happen. Let's send the most Pharisee of them all to teach Gentiles, to illustrate the idea that Gentiles could be saved without adherence to the law. They didn't have to become followers of the law first to become followers of Jesus. They could just become followers of Jesus. And again, nothing needs to be said about that because we spent so much time talking about that idea in Romans. So, okay, let's start reading Acts chapter 21 and verse 1. When we had parted from them and had set sail, we ran a straight course to Kos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. Having found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. When we came in sight of Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we kept sailing to Syria and landed at Tyre, for there the ship was to unload its cargo. After looking up the disciples, we stayed there 7 days, and they kept telling Paul through the Spirit not to set foot in Jerusalem. When our days there were ended, we left and started on our journey, while they all, with wives and children, escorted us until we were out of the city. After kneeling down on the beach and praying, we said farewell to one another. Then we went on board the ship, and they returned home again. When we had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais, and after greeting the brethren, we stayed with them for a day. On the next day, we came to Caesarea, and entering the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, we stayed with him. By the way, that one of the 7, if you remember when they appointed deacons, and Stephen was appointed as a deacon, this guy Philip was one of the men appointed with Stephen. I looked that up today, actually. It was interesting. All right, who was one of the 7, we stayed with him. Acts 21 and verse 9. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses. As we were staying there for some days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. And coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, "This is what the Holy Spirit says. In this way, the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." When we had heard this, we as well as the local residents began begging him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but even to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And since he would not be persuaded, we fell silent, remarking, "The will of the Lord be done." After these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us Mason of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing, with whom we were to lodge. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore, do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication." And Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law in this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them, And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another, and when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. When he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting, "Away with him!" As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness." But Paul said, "I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." When he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand, and when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect, saying, and you'll have to read that next Sunday with Robert. So, what the people thought was going to happen to Paul pretty much came true. I mean, up until this point, all we know is that there was a giant mob in Jerusalem, and it was stirred up by these Jews who had followed Paul from Asia. And the Jews from Asia were telling all of the other Jews in the temple that this man is teaching us that we don't have to follow Moses anymore. He's teaching us we don't have to circumcise our children. He's teaching us to forsake and turn away completely from Moses. And he's teaching that Gentiles don't have to follow Moses. And they used all of these inflammatory ideas, some of which, between me and you, were true. But they used these inflammatory ideas to stir up this mob, very similar to what happened to Jesus. And again, at this point, all we know, can suspect is going to happen is that Paul is going to be delivered into the Gentiles and he's going to be killed at Jerusalem. Of course, that's not what happens, but that's what happened here in Acts chapter 21. So just pointing out some of what these Jews from Asia were saying was true. Paul was teaching Gentiles did not have to circumcise children. He was teaching, in Romans chapter 14, he was teaching that you don't have to observe, for example, the customs of clean and unclean. He says everything is clean. You can eat whatever you want to eat. Do whatever you want to do. You don't have to follow the law as you had to under the old law, because, just to throw it in there again, the law, the adherence to the law was not what made a person righteous. Faith is what made a person righteous. But Paul is teaching the truth. Now, the one thing he is not teaching that we have talked about at length was that we are to forsake Moses. We don't forsake what Moses said, because Moses said Christ is coming. In Deuteronomy, he said there is someone coming who's going to talk to you, and you better listen to what he says to you. And remember, we said it again, Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. So the idea that we can forsake the old law, forsake the customs, and get rid of everything before Matthew is false. And I say that because Jesus himself said, I fulfilled all that. If all we had was the Old Testament scriptures, we would have enough to know who Jesus was. We would have enough to know that he wanted us to have faith in him for salvation, because he fulfilled all that. Now, we have more than that, obviously. We have the writings of the apostles who were with Jesus, who heard Jesus, who conveyed to us the teachings that Jesus taught them. So we know that we have more than that, but the idea that we forsake everything in the Old Testament is not correct. And in this case, it was an inflammatory remark to stir up the crowd, who were, as James said, primarily Jews, some Pharisees. All right. What did you guys see in Acts chapter 21? I've got 2 or 3 different things that I thought were interesting, but what do you guys think? So one of the things I think that's most fascinating about Paul, the character, is his relentless stubbornness. And stubbornness doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a good thing. And Paul, despite being warned from all of these people that he really loves, not to go to Jerusalem. Don't go to Jerusalem. Don't go to Jerusalem. Bad things are going to happen to you in Jerusalem. Paul says, I don't hear that. I am ready to die for the cause of Christ in Jerusalem. He is relentlessly pursuing the mission that Jesus had given him. Several of his letters, he talks about the grace that was shown to him. He talks about the gospel having been entrusted to him and how he is going to fulfill the mission that was given to him by Christ himself. And he is relentlessly in pursuit of filling that mission. And it's no coincidence then, he tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, when he does complete his mission, and he's ready to go because he's finished the mission. He says, verse 6 of 2 Timothy chapter 4, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. Paul says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Paul is relentlessly pursuing the finishing of his course, which he will do in Rome. I don't know if he knew that at the time here in Acts chapter 21, but he knows it eventually, that Rome is where his final destination is going to be, and he's going to testify to the emperor about Jesus Christ, the leader of the free world, so to speak. That would be the finishing of Paul's course, and nothing is going to dissuade him or persuade him from completing that mission. So I think that's admirable of Paul. And of course, his stubbornness before he became a Christian might have been his downfall, because he was stubbornly pursuing the Jewish course and persecuting the Christians. When he saw Jesus and was given his papers, so to speak, he completed that mission. To his death, he completed that mission. I think that's really unique, fascinating trait of Paul. All right, John, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. That John is correct. Paul says he's going, this was actually in Romans, so John has a really good memory. Paul says the last part of Romans, he's got a contribution from the saints, Macedonia and from Achaia, and he's got to bring that to Jerusalem. And that's partly why Paul is going to Jerusalem, but also he's ready to finish the course, which he thinks is going to be in Jerusalem, but he's ready to do what God wants him to do. I think it's good. Jordan? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really nice bookend to Paul. We start at a stoning, and now we're almost ending at a stoning, right? And of course, we know that the persecution at the time was Jewish in origin. It was the Jews from Asia stirring up the crowd. As Jordan said, they liked Paul when they thought he was on their team. And as soon as he switched, they began persecuting him just like he was persecuting the Christians. I wanted to mention, too, a passage that we read in Romans, Romans chapter 9 and verse 30. Paul, again, remember, chapters 9, 10, and 11, he's talking about the Jewish rejection of Christianity, expressing his lament that they are not have not accepted Christ. And he says about the Jews in chapter 9 and verse 30, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith. But as though it were by works, they stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. Paul is saying the Jews wanted to be declared righteous on the basis of their law keeping. They pursued righteousness as if it could be achieved by works. That was the stumbling stone. The stumbling stone was the idea that everybody in the world could be made righteous. And the Jews said, what do you mean everybody in the world can be made righteous? We're sons of Abraham. We've got the law. We've been observing this law, and you're saying we're not righteous because we've observed the law? And then what's the point, right? That was the stumbling stone of the Jews, and that was why it was such a heated issue. The Jews did not have an exclusive special place. Now, they did have a special place, as Paul said. They were the root of the olive tree in which all these Gentile branches were grafted in. The root belongs to the Jews. It always has and always will. But righteousness is not achieved. Righteousness is not assigned on the basis of law keeping, certainly not on the basis of keeping the Jewish old law. That was the stumbling stone. Righteousness of faith is the stumbling stone. And these Jews from Asia in Acts chapter 21 are stumbling over the same issue. That is righteousness by faith. All right. What else? Good. Yeah. 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 Caleb said several things that are good. Yeah. Of course, Paul was saying what he was saying, and they weren't getting it. I was in a meeting one time, and there was a topic that was trying to be explained to someone, and they clearly weren't getting it. And the person who was doing the explaining said, uh, I'm speaking all these words, and I see no signs of life in you. It's like you're just not getting it, right? These Jews got it enough to convict Paul, but they didn't get it. And Caleb said also Paul didn't think the situation was totally hopeless, right? He was going to preach the gospel just like God told him to, and that kind of goes back to what Paul said in Romans, I think chapter 11. At some point, the Jews may see the Gentiles being saved. And of course, the Gentiles were sending Christians in Jerusalem this gift, and the Jews may see their faith, and they may be grafted right back in to this olive tree. That may be what God is doing here, the partial hardening of the Jews that Paul mentions. And his desire was they all would be saved. And as Caleb said, they very well could be saved. He was going to continue to preach the truth until it all landed on whoever it was going to. Go ahead, Jordan. Yeah. 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 Sure. Well, right. Yeah, Jordan's saying he's not necessarily speaking to the Jews in Asia. He's speaking to the crowd who are rowdy and riled up because he may convince some of them. It's just like he's going to testify in Rome to Caesar. He's going to testify to Festus and Felix. He's going to testify to all these different people, and it may not all land, but some of it may land enough to start the seed. And that's what we said earlier. We're saved by our faith. We're saved at that point. Our faith continues to grow, and we continue to become a better person, more like Jesus. Hebrews, those who are, how does he say it? Those who are saved, those who are made perfect, are being sanctified. We're righteous on the basis of our faith. We're no more saved at the end than we are at the beginning, but we're continuing to become sanctified and more like Christ. And that's the beauty of the progression of faith, a progressive sanctification. We're saved and being made ready, being made perfect into Christ. Remember that Paul in Ephesians, the passage we read, I think last week, the edification is so that we'll all continue to grow into the unity of the perfect knowledge of Jesus. It is a work in process. All right, go ahead, John. They would have. They certainly would have. And the Romans were there by God's design to save Paul. And I think later on in the book of Acts, there are Jews that go hungry because they want to kill Paul. They're not going to eat until he's dead, at which point he appeals to Rome and he is taken to Rome. So super interesting story. Go ahead, Violet. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Violet says it seems like it was kind of planned. The Jews that made that big ruckus in Ephesus followed Paul from Asia to Jerusalem with the intent on stirring up the mob and trying to kill him. As they said before, he wasn't on their team anymore. He was on the opposite team, and they wanted to kill him. So yeah, I think that's certainly true. Go ahead, Caleb. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a time of upheaval, right? The Jewish population was unstable, unhappy under Roman rule. They were all, of course, looking for the Messiah to come. Uh, it was kind of like Caleb said, there was a riot, and they don't know what they're rioting about, but they're rioting for sure. Yeah. Oh, you're not that guy? Oh, you're not that one guy? No. Oh, okay. What are we rioting over again? I don't know. All right. Yeah. All right. One thing I think is super interesting. Oh, go ahead, Jacob. Yeah. 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 Yeah, Jacob makes the comparison of Peter telling Jesus he's not going to be killed, and Jesus said, "Oh, yes, I am." Uh, kind of what Paul is saying here. Despite being told by all these people that he loves, all the people that he's taught the gospel to, he says, "I am going to complete my mission. I'm ready to die to complete this work that God gave me to complete." So yeah, it's very similar. Yeah, we're going to do what God wants us to do, and if it kills us, then so be it. That's what we're going to do. That's what Paul did, certainly. Go ahead, Dan. Mhm. Right. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Dan said a lot. The measure of success isn't what we determine, it's what God determines. And so if we decide we're not going to do something because we don't think it's going to be successful, look at Paul. He was being told by the Spirit, this is not going to go well. And Paul says, yeah, I think I'll go anyway. I think I'll do it and do what God wants me to do and testify there. And of course, it didn't turn out well. Well, it turned out the way God wanted it to turn out, and that, of course, is that the gospel was taught. The gospel was taught to this mob of people, and it was taught to the people in Rome. And of course, as he said in the end of chapter Romans, he finally made it to the church at Rome. He wanted to meet with them, and he did on in this journey. So, yep. Go ahead, Glenn. Yeah. 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 The greater the sin, the greater the opportunity God gives you to make it right. The greater exemplified in Peter, exemplified in Paul. Yeah, Paul was given the opportunity to do as great a thing as the bad thing that he did to make that right. In Glenn's words, yeah, I think that's really good, really powerful. And just really quickly, there's this post on social media, a photographer. Trust me, this relates. So a photographer takes pictures of batters rounding third base, going home, and of course around home plate you see this guy's entire team ready to cheer on as he touches home base. And it says the photographer takes these pictures because he thinks that is what heaven is going to be like. We're rounding third base, we're going down to home, we're surrounded by all the Christians that are there cheering us on as we cross home plate. I think that's a super powerful example, and I think it's not inconceivable to think that people that Paul martyred were there cheering him on as he finished his course. I think that's a really powerful illustration of the power of the gospel, that is salvation to the Jew and Greek, to all who believe. I think that's a really good, powerful example. Yeah. Yeah, totally true. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's Acts chapter 23. I think Robert will go into that. Certainly, yeah. Super cool. Super cool story. All right, that's it for me. I'm done for the quarter. I really liked Galatians. I really liked Romans. I think there's a lot to Acts, these two chapters, that relate specifically to what we talked about and the things that Paul wrote in those two books. So that's it. Next Sunday, in a couple of days, you'll be Acts chapter 22, and Robert will be teaching that.